Now, the solar industry body, SAPVIA, has welcomed the grid capacity guidelines revealed earlier in the week. It has, however, expressed some concern about how legally binding they are. Frank Spencer is the spokesperson for SAPVIA. Frank, good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. Before we get into the guidelines, I just want to talk about one of the issues raised by the electricity minister in the briefing he gave over the weekend, and that was really around the risk of collapsing the grid if too much solar energy is brought on board too quickly. Let's speak about that risk factor and how damaging, or how much of a risk rather is it?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the show. I think today that risk is very, very small. We still need to see significant more amounts of solar built for that risk to become real. We really need to have quite a large amount of solar on the grid for that risk to basically come to pass. And we're still a long way from having that amount of solar on the grid that could cause a grid collapse.
Let's take a look at the latest guidelines. What do you make of them?
So I think it's a good step in the right direction. Before these guidelines, it was a bit of a free-for-all for large projects to access grid capacity, whether they were legitimate projects or not. So I do think that putting a proper process in place to acquire grid capacity for projects is good. However, I think in this case, Eskom has actually gone too far in terms of the requirements. They've basically made this the very last step now in the project development process, which means that developers would be taking significant risk and spending significant amounts of money to develop projects to bring electricity onto the grid without actually knowing whether they will get the grid or not. So I do think some parts of this need to be repealed.
Do you think that there is an aspect of Eskom wanting to protect itself? Because, of course, when it comes to big users, there are also large revenue generators.
It's possible, but I think Eskom has come around in the last 5 years or so to understand that the private sector really has a role to play in solving the electricity challenges. The private sector wants to come to the party and build new power plants to generate electricity, and they have the money to do this. So the fastest way to deploy new kilowatt hours onto the grid is through the private sector building new solar and wind farms. And truly, this, I think, is the way out of our electricity crisis.
What is the alternative, Frank? So what would you rather Eskom be doing in this moment?
So I think Eskom is on the right path. I do think, though, in terms of accessing the grid, some of the requirements could be scaled back. For example, the need to have fully completed an EIA process and on-site resource assessment. This could be done in parallel with the grid access process. And I do think that also the ability to co-locate, say, solar and wind farms together that complement each other at the same location. This is something that isn't in place yet, but that could be done to actually open up more capacity for more electricity.
Do you get the sense that there is perhaps also a way in which Eskom is wanting to stagger the power that is onboarded by the way in which the guidelines have been set up?
I don't think it's so much to stagger it. I think they are supportive of seeing new projects built as quickly as possible. Obviously, there are some capacity constraints within Eskom to actually do the work required around the grid studies and the permitting. But all in all, I do think that generally they're actually doing a good job in this space.
All right, we're going to leave it there for this afternoon. Frank Spencer is the spokesperson for SAPVIA.